First up this week, one country in particular has dominated headlines across the globe for less than positive reasons. Russia has been accused of carrying out a botched assassination attempt in Britain, cyber attacks around the world, and meddling in international politics. With all that in mind, let's hear our first number.
My number of the year is 9,041,308.
We like 'em big.
That's the total number of tweets that we know the Russian troll farm posted between 2014 and June of this year.
Ben Nimmo is Information Defence Fellow at Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab. He analysed data released this year by the biggest social media platforms.
The Russian Troll Farm is an organisation sometimes known as the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, which is a group of several hundred people paid by an oligarch very close to the Kremlin, who basically spent 12 hours a day online masquerading as citizens of various Western countries and posting all kinds of political and inflammatory comment, particularly about the US election. According to leaks from the Troll Farm, it's running well over 1,000 accounts, and it's got an audience of well over 1 million people. Over the 9 million plus tweets, slightly more than half were in Russian. They were saying that the Russian opposition and its leaders are in the pay of the CIA or in the pay of any particular Western government you would care to name. And it's always worth bearing in mind that the Russian troll operations started off as a way for the government to attack its own critics domestically.
Ben told us that just under half of the output was in English, with those tweets focusing on the United States.
In 2016, they were very heavily engaged in attacking Hillary Clinton, and you would have Russian troll accounts masquerading as liberals and masquerading as Black Lives Matter activists, masquerading as Democrat supporters, and they would all be posting hostile content about Clinton. And at the same time, you had a separate batch of accounts who were masquerading as far-right Americans, white supremacists, Donald Trump supporters, and they were posting favourable comment about Donald Trump.
The tweets didn't stop with the election. Trolls shifted their focus to polarising public opinion on issues like gun control.
Some of them were very, very influential. You had accounts out there with over 100,000 followers. Some of the Facebook pages had 200,000 or 300,000. One of the accounts on the day of the election in 2016 tweeted that there was evidence that the voting machines had been rigged in favour of Clinton, and it had 25,000 retweets in the space of a couple of hours. Trolls have always been known to boast about how effective they are, so you need to be very sceptical about the exact numbers, but all the indications are that the troll farm is still operating and it's still posting divisive content.
Ben Nimmo and the Russian trolls. Trolls masquerading as members of the public is one thing, but what happens when you can't even trust your leaders not to spread disinformation? Our American counterparts have been having a fruitful 2 years of disproving claim after claim. Heather Long, the economics correspondent for The Washington Post, spoke to us about her colleague's quest to separate fact from fiction.
My number of the year is 2.
That's a bit more manageable than our first number. Or is it?
I chose that because President Trump has made more than double the amount of false claims this year in 2018 than he did in his first year in office in 2017.
Over the last 2 years, the team have been closely following the president's tweets, statements, and speeches.
In 2017, the team recorded just shy of 2,000 falsehoods that the president made. This year, we're still obviously tallying the final numbers, but it looks like it's going to hit around 4,500. So again, more than double the amount. Last year, he was doing about 5 inaccurate claims per day. This year, he bumped that to 30 a day. Over 100 times this year, he's talked about passing the biggest tax cut in history. That is not true in the U.S. context nor in the global context. The tax cut that passed under the president was the biggest corporate tax cut in history, but not for families and households. Another one, he said around 70-some times that his border wall is already being built between the United States and Mexico, while there has been some funding devoted to prototyping a wall or building some basic fencing down along that border between the U.S. and Mexico. There certainly is no huge Trump wall down there. What really made double the number of false claims was what he was doing in the 7 weeks leading up to the election. In particular, he would do these campaign-like speeches. He would travel the country. He usually speaks for about an hour in front of the crowd. He loves it. He thrives on it. You can tell he's enjoying himself. But that's when we would start to see these 30 incorrect claims a day. So while he does still tweet some inaccurate things, I think the real driving force are those campaign-like speeches.
Politicians bending the truth. Who ever heard of such a thing?
What you would see with past presidents, whether it was George W. Bush or Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, you would see these sort of half-truths. They would take a fact and spin it a little bit, obviously to make themselves look better, whereas President Trump will just flat out say things that are totally wrong. We expect 2019 is going to be even higher ahead of that 2020 re-election campaign.
Have along, fighting real fake news. Next up, we head to Nigeria, and a number that shows how we take some basic necessities for granted.
My number of the year is 90.8. That's the percentage of Nigerians who lack access to safe drinking water. Drinking water in Nigeria should be free of E. coli. E. coli is a type of bacteria that is essentially found in human intestines. And so when you have E. coli contamination, it is a sort of an indication that probably the water has been contaminated by feces of human or animals.
Orwell Okpi is a journalist, researcher and community manager for fact-checking organisation Africa Check. They were asked to check a claim that 80% of Nigerian households did not have access to safe drinking water. After analysing a large-scale survey, Orwell discovered the claim was actually an underestimate.
Of the 13,000 households surveyed, less than 10% drank water that was free of E. coli. And then that's how we're arrived at the number, 90.8%. It does range from state to state, region to region. Generally, we noted that it's worse in the north compared to the south. Most of the states in the north has larger percentages in terms of households that couldn't get access to potable water compared to most of the states in the south. The survey also looked at it in terms of the source of the water and also tested the water at home.
They found that the water for over 77% of households was contaminated at the source. In other words, from wherever the water originated.
When they then checked at home, the number went up to 90.8%, meaning that obviously there was some form of extra contamination happening with transporting this water to the homes.
Of all the piped water sources examined, only 34% were free from E. coli. And of the open wells surveyed, only 2% were free from contamination.
Meaning that about 98% of water from such sources were unsafe.
Africa Check's Orwell Okpi. Thanks to all our contributors for their numbers of the year. Do listen out for next week's edition where there'll be more numbers from around the world. Until next week, bon anno, frohes neues Jahr, and a happy numerical new year.
This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello and welcome to More or Less, the programme which sweetens the bitter pill of life with the honeyed delights of statistical truth. This week, which planet is usually closest to the Earth? The answer may surprise you. Do prisoners really get more time outdoors than children? And a running commentary on this recent edition of the Today programme.
The headlines this morning: rail fares go up by around 3% today, despite continuing evidence of poor service and punctuality.
We'll get back to that claim after a brief delay, but first...
Young children are eating more sugar than the recommended maximum for an adult. Public Health England is warning.
Yes, the nation greeted the new year with a series of less than cheering headlines about sugar. For example, the claim that children typically exceed the recommended total sugar consumption for an 18-year-old by the age of 10. Oh gosh. This target, by the way, refers to something called free sugars, which include table sugar, sugar added by manufacturers to meals or drinks, honey and fruit juice. It doesn't include the naturally occurring sugar in milk or in whole fruit. The target is that we should get no more than 5% of our calorie intake from these free sugars, and neither adults nor children are anywhere near getting under that target. But keen to get an alternative perspective, I spoke to Christopher Snowdon, the head of lifestyle economics at the free market think tank, the Institute for Economic Affairs. As you might expect, he is against over-regulation and all kinds of nanny statery. So I asked him why sugar consumption has been rising. His answer? It hasn't.
Sugar consumption per capita seems to have peaked in around the 1960s and started falling from the 1970s. Even at the start of the 20th century, we were consuming about 41 kilograms per person. Currently, we're consuming something in the region of 33 kilograms, and at its peak in the 1960s it was getting close to 50 kilograms per person. If you look at the food surveys, there's what is now known as the Family Food Survey, which began in 1940, and that looks at people's consumption over obviously many decades. That shows that since 1992 added sugar consumption has fallen by about 28%. Then there's a National Diet and Nutrition Survey, which shows that since the year 2000, adult consumption of sugar has fallen by about 10%. Amongst younger children, since 1997, it's fallen by 29%. And amongst teenagers, since 1997, it's fallen by 18%.
Well, this was news to us, so we took a look at the data. And as far as we can work out, Christopher Snowdon is right. For example, the Family Food Survey shows that since 2001, sugar consumption per person has fallen fairly steadily from 92 grams a day to 71 grams a day. And unsurprisingly then, the percentage of energy derived from sugars has fallen from just below 15% to about 13%. The National Diet and Nutrition Survey paints a similar picture. Over the past 6 or 7 years, sugar consumption has fallen a little both for adults and children. According to that measure, adults now get 11.1% of their energy from sugar. Remember, the target is 5%. Longer-term data from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization shows sugar consumption in the UK falling from over 45 kilograms per person per year in the early 1960s to under 35 kilograms per person per year today, a fall of about a third. Those data are derived from bulk imports and exports of sugar, so we can't be sure exactly what's being consumed by humans. All of these sources use different methods, have different limitations, and are not fully in agreement with each other, but the trend does seem to be slowly and steadily downwards. So, I asked Christopher Snowdon why, given this apparently encouraging track record, last week's headlines were so apocalyptic.
Well, the main reason that children and indeed adults are consuming twice as much sugar as the government recommends is that the government halved the guidelines in 2015. Previously, the dietary guidelines had said that people should try to limit their sugar consumption to 10% of their overall daily calorie intake. And in 2015, it was somewhat arbitrarily halved to just 5%.
Chris Snowdon of the Institute for Economic Affairs. So, was the target arbitrarily halved, or was there a good reason for it? The target is set by Public Health England after seeking the advice of the Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition. The decision is helpfully explained in a document called Why 5%? The committee searched for the highest quality data on sugar and health outcomes, and they found good evidence linking sugar to tooth decay in children, and linking sugary drinks to weight gain, again in children. But the committee didn't find good evidence linking sugar to tooth decay in adults, or to obesity in adults, or to colorectal cancer, or heart disease. Some studies suggested that sugary drinks are associated with a higher risk of diabetes, but the strongest studies, the randomised controlled trials, don't show that. In contrast to this long list of problems for which no evidence was found, the committee did find that when people consume more sugar, they don't fully compensate by cutting their calorie intake elsewhere. In other words, if you cut down on sugar, you'll probably cut down on calories overall. And it was that finding that led to the recommended tightening of the target to 5%. The reasoning is that most of us consume too many calories, and there's good reason to think that if we consumed less sugar, we'd also consume fewer calories. Still, I was surprised that the target had been tightened so sharply when the committee had so often failed to find good evidence linking sugar with bad health outcomes. So I dialed up Dr. Louis Levy, Head of Nutrition Science at Public Health England. I asked him whether I'd misunderstood the report's finding that sugar isn't associated with obesity in adults.
So I think you slightly misunderstood. They did find evidence of an association with sugar and weight gain is essentially obesity when it gets to its highest level. They only found limited evidence from different types of evidence, so not the randomised controlled trial that's the gold standard, but they found something from prospective studies, so this is studies where you're observing things in relation to dental caries. And they found no relationship between sugar and the development of diabetes, so it's slightly different to how you've prescribed it.
So I'm just looking at the committee report, and it does say there's insufficient evidence of appropriate quality to draw conclusions on the impact of sugar's intake on the majority of cardiometabolic outcomes in adults, including body weight. So, I mean, that's from the committee's own report.
Yeah. So I was talking, when I gave you my statement, I was talking about the link particularly for children. Okay. And there was good evidence for children. And there's no reason to believe that evidence would be any different for adults, although obviously, as it said, there wasn't as much evidence for that.
Okay, so all right, so I did read the evidence correctly. Then they didn't manage to find a link between sugar and body weight in adults. So
they didn't find good studies that allowed them to make the same conclusion as they were able to draw in children.
Yeah, but I mean, they did have some randomised controlled trials.
Yeah.
That seemed not to find an association.
So there are some studies that don't find an association. However, overall, when you take the body of the evidence together, they concluded that there was an association between sugar intake and weight.
Although, just to underline, they found that for children, not adults. So I asked Louis Levy what he made of the claim that we're eating less sugar.
So generally speaking, sugar levels in our diet have remained constant as a percentage of energy. There has been small changes over time, but generally speaking, we're still consuming more sugar than the maximum recommendation.
So the small changes up or down, or just fluctuations?
There'll be fluctuations. So from one year it will go up and the following year it will go down.
Well, far be it from me to disagree with the head of nutrition science at Public Health England, but I couldn't help but dig out the data during our interview. And it really does look like it's going down, doesn't it?
If you draw a line, it would look like a slight downward trend. But if you look at the percentage change, it's very small compared to the absolute amount of sugar. Percentage changes are very small, but that can mean a fair amount of sugar in your diet.
So it is going down?
I think the issue is that we're eating too much sugar. Even if the sugar is going down by a small amount, that doesn't mean that we can stop worrying about the sugar content of our diet. What we're talking about here is a public health priority. We're all consuming twice as much sugar as is recommended as a maximum, and that's also helping us achieve weights that are over healthy weights, and that's going to lead to a large range of potential issues around cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes and some cancers. Worrying about small percentage changes in sugars is actually missing the bigger public health priority, which is health.
The Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition, though, couldn't find evidence that it was happy with linking sugar to diabetes, linking sugar to cardiovascular disease.
The question you're asking is about sugar, and I'm saying that sugar is a calorie intake. We're eating twice as much sugar as we should be. We as a nation are growing bigger. Weight is directly associated with ill health.
Dr. Louis Levy of Public Health England. You're listening to More or Less. And our email address for your questions and your comments is moreorless@bbc.co.uk. Now, back to school and back to work we go after the Christmas break, dragging ourselves off the sofa and out into the real world. It's hard enough as it is, but many people who, like me, travel by train have also had to deal with a more expensive train ticket. On average, British rail fares have gone up by 3.1%, which is well above the headline inflation measure, CPIH, which is currently 2.2%. All this prompted much news coverage of where this extra money would go, and Phoebe Keane has been looking into this for us. Hello, Phoebe.
Hello, Tim. So, BBC News Online reported that the rail industry says 98p of every pound spent on a ticket is invested back into the network. So, what do you think when you hear that, Tim?
Well, to an economist like me, invested means spent on something that's going to be useful for a long time. So I'm thinking new trains, new tracks, new stations, that kind of thing.
Well, I think this is the one occasion, or one of those rare occasions, where economists and everyone else use the word in the same way. But is 98p in every pound invested? Well, our eagle-eyed listeners weren't convinced. Charles DeVille wrote in.
Surely the trains cost more than the remaining 2 pence to operate.
Well, he was absolutely right. But the fault lies not with the rail industry, but with the BBC, which misquoted the industry body, the Rail Delivery Group. So the Rail Delivery Group simply said that 98p in every pound paid in fares goes back into running the railway.
Oh dear, so our listeners were right. So how much of this money is spent on running costs and how much is on genuine investment?
Well, it isn't intended to be spent on investment, but to cover the running costs of the railways. Much of the money spent on investment actually comes from a government subsidy. Some might come indirectly from ticket prices, for example, covering the cost of leasing new trains, which in turn have been paid for by private investors. But the ticket fares don't directly fund investment. What is true is that of the ticket price, 2p in every pound is profit and 98p covers costs of one form or another.
That wasn't the only problem our listeners found, was it?
No. On the Today programme, the Transport Secretary, Chris Grayling, made this statement.
The reality is that the fare increases are higher than they should be because the unions demand, with threats of national rail strikes that don't get them, higher pay rises than everybody else.
A number of listeners wrote in saying surely the union pay settlements couldn't be blamed for the fare increases.
Well, anyone can be blamed for anything, fairly or not, and some unions have secured above inflation pay rises for their members, although I'm not sure I'd endorse Chris Grayling's claim that there is literally nobody in the country doing better than that. The question is, what proportion of the train company's ticket revenue is spent paying salaries?
It's about 25p in the pound. So big salary increases may be part of the story, but not all or even most of it. There are plenty of other costs, from contractors to leasing costs to fuel.
Still, I'm sure few people would begrudge paying more for their tickets as long as we felt confident the trains were going to run on time. Which they do, right?
Well, actually, Tim, train punctuality is the worst that it's been in a decade.
It's Deborah Ashby, the new president of the Royal Statistical Society, appeared by statistical magic in the studio. Hello, Deborah. Welcome. You're not a trains person. Why have you got statistics about trains in your head?
I'm not a trains person, though I do love travelling on them. But it's because the Royal Statistical Society run a competition for Statistics of the Year, and one of this year's top 10 is to do with train punctuality.
Yeah, so when you say top 10, this is not the most exciting, cheery, inspiring statistics, but just the most informative.
The most informative, and we tried to pick the ones that characterised 2018 in various ways, and we tried to pick some good ones, but this one isn't on the cheery list. So the proportion of British trains that ran on time is 85.9%, and that is the worst it's been in a decade.
Which is not great. So what's the definition of running on time?
It's within 5 minutes if they're short haul and 10 minutes if it's a longer train.
And nearly 15% of trains miss that.
That's right. And then I think the ones that really stick in people's minds are the ones that are badly delayed. which are at least 30 minutes late. We've now got 4.6% of the trains which are delayed to that extent. And that is the worst it's been since 2001, 2002, which, if we go back, is actually when Big Breakfast, Big Break was on television, just after we all stopped worrying about the Millennium Bug. So that is much, much worse.
The Royal Statistical Society picked this statistic because this, in some way, sums up life in Britain today, at least for commuters.
It does, and there's been a lot of debate about train lateness, and sometimes bad things stick in your mind, but actually you look at the statistics and they're quite good. But actually this does demonstrate that the general feeling that there's an awful lot of train delays really is what's happening.
Professor Deborah Ashby, the new president of the Royal Statistical Society. During our time off air, we were contacted by loyal listener Jan, who wrote to moreorless at bbc.co.uk to say,
I've become increasingly aware of the confidently delivered fact that today children spend less time out of doors than inmates in Her Majesty's prisons. How substantial is this evidence base?
We tracked this back to Purcell's 2016 Dirt is Good campaign, which aimed to get children playing outside more often and accumulating a few stubborn stains on their formerly pristine white clothes. Here's a clip of their advert, Free the Kids, in which prisoners are asked to reflect on just how much their brief time outside means to them.
How would you feel if your yard time was reduced to just 1 hour a day?
Would be torture.
Do you know who does have only 1 hour outdoors per day? Children.
Wow. That's depressing.
Now, I'm not going to lie, I love this advertisement, and I completely sympathise with the idea that children should have less structured time indoors and more aimless time to mess around. In fact, there's even a chapter of one of my books arguing this. But when I completely sympathise is exactly the moment at which my critical faculties shut down. So Jan's quite right to ask, is the claim actually true? Do children in the UK really spend less time out of doors than prisoners? The prisoners in the advert say they spend 2 hours outside every day, but as you may have noticed, they're in Indiana. What about prisoners in the UK? Our correspondent, Jordan Dunbar, is innocent until proven guilty, but he went to Buckley Hall, a Category C prison in the northwest of England, to join some inmates in their weekly park run.
There's your pass, you're all ready and all booked into Buckley Hall.
Lads, how are we doing this morning?
Wonderful.
Yeah, you're doing well. So on an average day, how often do you reckon you get outside?
Outside?
Yeah, outside. Not just in the gym, but actually outside in the fresh air.
Probably, you get probably an hour.
Get an hour?
About an hour, yeah. About an hour outside a day.
Yeah.
In the fresh air.
Have either of you been elsewhere? Have you been in other prisons?
I've been in a few jails, yeah. But
what are they like compared to this one in terms of times outside?
I think the time outside in the fresh air is pretty much similar.
Yeah? But about an hour on average?
About an hour and a half. The exercise each day, yeah, you'll usually get one exercise in the morning and an exercise at the night.
These prisoners say they're outside for about an hour a day. That's in line with recommendations from the United Nations. Inmates should get 60 minutes a day of outdoor time. These scenarios were painted as apocalyptic by the Purcell advertisements, but rightly or wrongly they seem to be pretty common. So, what about children? Do British children really spend less than an hour outside every day? Well, Lizzie McNeil has been looking at this for us. Hello, Lizzie.
Hi, Tim.
So where does this number come from?
Unilever, which owns Purcell, commissioned a survey from a marketing firm called Edelman. Edelman surveyed 12,000 parents who had at least one child aged between 5 and 12. Only 2,000 of these parents were from the UK.
And what did the survey ask the parents?
It asked them to divide their child's typical weekday, not weekend, into segments of time spent doing different activities or tasks, like sleeping, travelling, structured education, quality family time.
Hey, quality family time. I like it. In case my children are listening, I'd just like to reassure them that all family time is quality family time.
Of course. And the category playing outside took up only 4% of an average weekday.
So that's just under an hour a day, which is pretty much the same as British prisoners.
Yes, but there's also time spent outside during the school day, and this doesn't seem to have been estimated. So, we asked a friend of the programme, Laura McInerney of TeacherTapp, to run a quick survey among primary school teachers. This informal survey suggested that kids were outside for between 45 minutes and an hour during each school day.
So, apart from that nice little survey, do we have any data on how much time children are spending out of doors that isn't produced for the purposes of selling detergent?
Well, the Office for National Statistics has published a report studying 1,820 children's engagement with the outdoors and sports activities. They found that children aged between 8 and 15 spent just over an hour of their leisure time on an average day taking part in an outdoor activity, sports-related activity, or travelling on foot or by bicycle. This data was from 2015, and so far is the only time that the ONS has looked into time spent outdoors by children. Other academics are doing independent studies, but there isn't anything concrete just yet.
So the information's patchy, but we reckon almost an hour outdoors during the school day and another hour during leisure time. Yeah. So that's twice as much outdoor time as UK prisoners. I guess the real issue is probably not so much outdoor play as unsupervised, unscheduled independent play, and that might well be in short supply both for children and for prisoners. But as far as the Purcell advertisements claims go, they don't wash with us. Thanks, Lizzie. Last spring, loyal listener Graham Sherman was settling down to enjoy an episode of BBC 4's Sky at Night about
Mars, our nearest neighbour,
which to him hit a wrong note.
Ignoring the Earth's moon, I think this is not really correct. Surely the planet Venus has the closest orbit to the planet Earth.
Our listener Graham added that while Venus's orbit, the elliptical path it traces through space, is closest to Earth's, that doesn't mean that Venus itself is closer than Mars. Sometimes it is, and sometimes not. Each planet takes a different time to orbit the Sun, so sometimes Mars will be quite close to us, while Venus will be way over on the opposite side of the Sun. So we got in touch with Chris Lintott, the Sky at Night presenter you heard, who's also Professor of Astrophysics at Oxford University. And he told us that Graham Sherman was quite right. Venus's orbit is closer to Earth's than Mars's is. However, he did check. And on the day of broadcast, Mars was closer to us than Venus. Calculating which planet is closest when is a fun problem, he told us. Well, we like a fun problem, and so does Oliver Hawkins, more or less alumnus and statistical legend. He wrote some code for us which calculated which planet was closest to Earth on each day for the past 50 years, and then sent the results to David A. Rothery, Professor of Planetary Geosciences at the Open University. So, which planet is closest to us most often? Venus or Mars?
It kind of depends on how you phrase your question, but if you want to know on average which planet is closest to the Earth, it's neither Venus nor Mars. It is in fact Mercury.
But Mercury's... Huh? Just explain. How can that be? Because Mercury's further away from us than Venus.
It's surprised. Yes, it is. It surprised me too. Well, Mercury orbits the Sun closer than Venus does. The order out from the Sun is Mercury, Venus, then the Earth. But when Venus is on the far side of the Sun from the Earth, it's a lot further away than Mercury ever gets. So the planet that can come closest ever is Venus. The planet that can come the second closest ever is Mars. But the planet that spends most of its time closer to the Earth than any of the other planets do is Mercury. Mercury is actually the closest planet to Earth 46% of the time, and Venus is closest to us 36% of the time, and Mars is closest to us only 18% of the time.
So, I should just ask then, why do we keep talking about going to Mars rather than going to Venus? It's not because Mars is closer, it's because it's a more hospitable or less inhospitable planet.
Well, that's right. Mars is a place which might harbour life, and it's not too hot at the surface. Your spacecraft can operate for a long time. If you land on Venus, it's very hot because the dense atmosphere traps the heat. But you might think you'd go to Mercury because it's, on average, the closest planet to the Earth. But actually, it's the most difficult planet to get to because when you go to Mercury, you're falling in towards the sun and picking up speed. And that's why the Bepi Colombo mission that I'm working on is taking 7 years to get into orbit around Mercury, because it has to have several flybys shedding speed. So its final approach is going slowly enough to get into orbit. So it's not just about closeness, it's about the trajectory that you need to take to get there and not arrive too fast.
Now, our more or less a former colleague and statistical hero, Oliver Hawkins, actually wrote a programme to calculate these distances for us. I felt like I should be able to look this up on Wikipedia or something, but this has never been done. Is that right?
I couldn't find an easy answer to this. I'm loving looking at this little plot we've produced showing these wiggly lines. You look at this plot, you can't see that Mercury is on average any closer than Venus. They look about the same, but if you actually work it out with the averages, you can see Mercury is definitely on average closer than Venus.
So, would it be fair to say Mercury is our nearest neighbour of all the planets?
Not today. Today it's Venus. If you go out in the morning, you can see Venus there. It's just overtaken the Earth, very bright object. But on average, if you want to take a long-term average, the answer is Mercury.
Professor David Rothery of the Open University. By the way, Chris Lintott did admit to us that while Mars was indeed closer than Venus on the day the Sky at Night was broadcast, he didn't think to check where Mercury was. And yes, Mercury was closer still. Thanks to Oliver Hawkins and to all the listeners, loyal and otherwise, who wrote to more or less at bbc.co.uk with questions and ideas while we were off air. Please keep those emails coming in. We will be back next week, and until then, goodbye.
More or Less was presented by Tim Harford, OBE. It was produced by Ruth Alexander, OBE, with help from Phoebe Keane, OBE, Lizzie McNeil, OBE, and Bethan Head, OBE. It was mixed by Neil Churchill, OBE. The editor is Sir Richard Varden.
This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
Real protection means not having to be your own 24/7 monitoring expert. With ADT, you have best-in-class monitoring professionals there for you at the times you need it most. Wherever you go, the safety net of ADT is with you. 18,000 employees, safeguarding you and direct connections with first responders. That's real protection. No matter how you define safety, ADT is there. Visit adt.com/podcast to learn more about how ADT can design and install a secure smart home just for you.
Welcome to More or Less. I'm Javier Zapata with your statistical guide to the numbers in the news and in your body. This week, the tongues of hell.
The tongues of hell are dull. Dull as the triple tongues of dull, fat Cerberus who wheezes at the gate.
Sylvia Plath, reading from her poem, Fever, 103 degrees. That's a high fever. 103 degrees Fahrenheit is over 39 degrees Celsius. The kind of fever that'll have you ranting on about the three-headed hound of Hades wheezing in your face. Your body's like a furnace. As it works to keep you alive, it's constantly burning. If it puts out more or less heat than normal, it means something's wrong, usually an infection. Temperature's one of the ways that doctors can tell the difference between health and disease. I should know. I've spent the last 7 months recovering from a debilitating viral infection, and it all started with high fever, the tongues of hell. So I want to learn more about the numbers inside my body's furnace. There's a widely held concept of an adult's normal body temperature. Put it into a Google search and you'll get the number 37 degrees Celsius. That's 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's this 98.6 number that you'll find in school textbooks going back over a century. It's the pub quiz answer, the figure people intuitively reach for. Why? Turns out this number is based on the work of a German physician called Karl Wunderlich, who wrote a book on body temperature in 1868. He wrote that when a human is in a normal condition, the general temperature of the body is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. He also said that we're cooler in the morning than in the afternoon, that women are slightly hotter than men, and that doctors should see normal temperature as a range. Wunderlich defined 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit as the upper limit of normal, so anything above that he considered a fever. So who is Karl Wunderlich? How did he work it all out? And did he get it right?
Wunderlich did his work in Germany in the mid-1800s.
Dr. Philip Mackowiak is an infectious disease physician and a medical historian at the University of Maryland School of Medicine.
It was the height of the Industrial Revolution. The zeitgeist of that particular era, at least in medicine, extolled careful, repetitive, analytic observations, which he embodied beautifully.
Today we associate medical science with this kind of observational work on patients. But not long before Wunderlich's birth, doctors were learning medicine out of textbooks based on the ideas of a 2nd century Greek physician called Galen.
For over a millennium and a half, Galen's ideas prevailed. George Washington, when he developed his fatal pharyngeal infection, was bled 5 pints of blood, which almost certainly hastened his demise. And this was related back to concepts that Galen helped publicize 1,600 years earlier.
George Washington died in 1799. 16 years later, Karl Wunderlich was born into a century that would bring about a revolution in medicine. Sadly, his father died when he was just a little boy, so his French mother and maternal grandmother took care of his education. Under their influence, the boy developed a love of French culture and a haughty, aristocratic manner. His classmates called him the Marquis. This francophilia was important, as many of the most exciting innovations in medical science were happening in France.
He graduated from medical school in Germany, but the important things in terms of clinical medicine were happening in Paris and Vienna, and he traveled outside of Germany to learn things like auscultation using a Lennox stethoscope. He brought these ideas back to Germany with him.
Wunderlich was listening to the sounds of the body for the first time. The heart. The lungs. He was learning that true medical knowledge comes from intimate observation of living, breathing humans, not from the dusty textbooks that pushed Galen's ancient dogmas. He was part of a swelling storm of scientific innovation.
When the Industrial Revolution comes around, this idea that you need to validate concepts by specific observation takes hold and explodes. And part of this had to do with urbanization, when hospitals were bringing together a large number of patients who could be observed. It was a time when Lennox invented the stethoscope. Pasteur was just starting his work that would be the basis for microbiology. Florence Nightingale was doing epidemiological studies.
Wunderlich became chair in medicine at the German University of Leipzig, and it was there that he published his famous work on temperature.
During a period of 18 years, he collected temperature data on a massive body of patients in the clinics at that university. And by massive, we're talking about 25,000 patients with over 1 million different measurements taken. Today, we would call a data set that size as, quote, big data. In analyzing those data, he came up with his conclusions regarding the normal characteristics of the human body temperature, the most important of which was the idea that at baseline, The normal temperature of humans is 98.6 or 37 degrees centigrade.
So why has this number persisted for a century and a half? Dr. Mackowiak says it's partly because his dataset was so intimidatingly large.
Nobody was in a position or had the desire to amass a data set that large. Until just very recently, that data set has never been equaled in terms of its size.
Wunderlich didn't have today's statistical techniques and computer technology to fully analyze a dataset that big. But still, the number 98.6 persists, even though various studies have started chipping away at the sacredness of this figure. Dr. Mackowiak did his own research.
When I looked at 98.6 degrees, it was nowhere near the most common temperature. In fact, it was only seen 8% of the time.
The average temperature of Dr. Mackowiak's subjects was 98.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Other research has come up with even lower numbers. A recent study in the British Medical Journal, the only piece of research that has taken more data from patients than Wunderlich, found an average of just under 97.9. So why did Wunderlich get a different number? Part of the answer came to Dr. Mackowiak on a trip to a medical museum in Philadelphia.
And as we're wandering through it with the chief curator, Gretchen Warden, we come to a case with thermometers in it. And I mentioned to her that I was interested in temperature, in particular Wunderlich. And she says, "Oh, Wunderlich? Well, we have one of his thermometers." I said, "My heavens, can I see it?" And she said, "Sure, would you like to borrow it?" I almost fell over.
Dr. Mackowiak was now holding a piece of medical history. He took it home, made some measurements, and discovered
Wunderlich's thermometer was calibrated almost 3 degrees Fahrenheit higher than either the thermometers we use currently or the thermometers that were being used by other groups in Europe at the time Wunderlich did his experiments.
That's a big margin. So why wasn't Wunderlich miles off Dr. Mackowiak's number? Turns out he was taking measurements in the armpit, what doctors call the axilla. This gives you a reading 2 to 3 degrees Fahrenheit lower than taking measurements orally, which is generally how doctors take your temperature today. So did Wunderlich get it wrong?
His observations would still be relevant, but have to be modified with the knowledge that his thermometers were calibrated differently and that he was measuring axillary temperatures.
So what Wunderlich called the proud, silently advancing power of natural science has dispelled the sanctity of his 98.6 number. But his concepts about the importance of body temperature, how it varies depending on time of day and gender, remain valid. Recent studies show it's plausible that average temperature is between just under 97.9 and 98.2 degrees Fahrenheit. That's around 36.6 Celsius. Remember, normal temperature is a range, but it's plausible that this research implies that some people are running fevers at lower temperatures than is commonly supposed. No doubt in time we'll find out more about the subtle mathematics of our body's furnaces, but Wunderlich's discoveries are still vitally relevant. It means a doctor can quickly tell the difference between sickness and health. Some infections are life-threatening, especially if you don't get medical help in time. Wunderlich's revelations have been saving lives around the world for a century and a half.
This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello and welcome to More or Less, the programme which straightens the tie of statistics and gives them a kiss on the cheek before sending them out to face the day. This week, one of our loyal listeners is told by a dating app that she has 15,000 admirers. That sounds exhausting, but can she believe the numbers? The IMF says that Venezuela will suffer inflation of 10 million%. You want to know what that means and whether it's all a load of bolivars. But first, last Sunday was Holocaust Memorial Day, a day of solemn remembrance. But it was also a day of appalled surprise, because a poll was published claiming that
many as 1 in 20 adults in Britain don't believe the Holocaust took place, and 1 in 12 believe its scale has been exaggerated.
1 in 20 Britons. That would be about 3 million people not believing that the Holocaust happened. The survey said that many others were confused about the details. So to clear up any uncertainty, at least here, the Holocaust is a name given to the genocidal murder of around 6 million Jews, led by the German state under Adolf Hitler's Nazi government, and part of an even bigger policy of systematic murder of a variety of targets, including the Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, and many others. We've always known that a few people love to claim that this never happened or happened on a dramatically smaller scale. But as many as 1 in 20? Loyal listeners were quick to ask questions. George Gallant perhaps best summed up the mood in our inbox.
This statistic paints a particularly bleak picture of a population I don't recognise. Is it really possible that 1 in 20 of us don't believe that the Holocaust occurred?
A number of listeners had tried to do the fact-checking themselves and got as far as the website of the organisation which had commissioned the poll, the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust. But they didn't find much detail to go on. So, Ruth Alexander is here. Hello, Ruth.
Hi, Tim.
And you've been following up.
Yes, the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust provided only basic information on its website press release. This was a survey of more than 2,000 people, it said, carried out by a market research company called Opinion Matters. And these, the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust said, were the views of a representative sample of UK adults. But we, and many of our listeners, wanted to know more.
Well, first of all, we need to know precisely what people were asked and how.
Yes, so I asked for and was given the actual survey questions.
And then what we need is a professor of survey methodology.
Coming up.
I'm Peter Lynn. I'm Professor of Survey Methodology at the University of Essex.
That'll do.
Now, when Professor Lynn heard about the results of this survey, he raised an eyebrow.
Yes, I was immediately sceptical that this sounded a bit unlikely.
The number sounds too big.
Yes.
In fact, I've spoken to 3 other survey design experts. They all agree there are some serious flaws with this study. Now, it's true that 5% of people surveyed agreed or strongly agreed with the statement that the Holocaust never really happened. However, Professor Lynn thinks they may not all have done so deliberately.
I guess the first thing that struck me was that the wording of the question about believing that the Holocaust happened seems to me to have some serious shortcomings, and I think that may have caused some people to appear to agree that the Holocaust had never really happened when that wasn't what they intended.
So the issue here is that people taking part in an online survey like this, they're ticking boxes, maybe they're not looking too closely. Maybe they're in a hurry, they're distracted by what's on TV, they're thinking more about the shopping vouchers they might receive for doing the survey than what they're actually agreeing or disagreeing with. And some of them might make outrageous claims just for the fun of it.
After all, according to the latest census, there are 177,000 people living in the UK who follow the Jedi religion, the worship of the mythology of Star Wars.
Which is a more good-natured piece of trolling, but it's trolling nonetheless. And the point is that when you're talking about a small percentage of people giving an outrageous response, the results are easily skewed by a few wind-up merchants, drunks, and people randomly ticking boxes because they just don't care. So what did the survey do to weed out this sort of thing?
Well, not as much as we might hope. First of all, the term Holocaust wasn't explained, and Professor Lynn says that's poor practice. It would have been better if the survey designers had explained the term and said it refers to the systematic murder of millions of people by the Nazi state. Now, to the questions in the survey. Question 1 asked respondents how many Jewish people did they think were murdered in the Holocaust, and people's answers ranged from 0 through to 6 billion.
Which is more than the population of the planet at the time.
Now, question 2 asked, when roughly do you think the Holocaust ended? And you could choose a date from 1863 through to 1981, or say none of these or don't know. And the third question presented 10 statements, and respondents had to pick an answer from a response scale from strongly agree to strongly disagree or don't know. Here are some of the statements.
It is important to know about the Holocaust in today's world. More needs to be done to educate people about what happened during the Holocaust. The Holocaust never really happened. Something like the Holocaust couldn't happen again.
And it was the third statement in that list, the Holocaust never really happened, which 5% of respondents said they agreed or strongly agreed with, and which created all the media shock headlines. But Professor Lin says many of them could easily have agreed with this statement by mistake.
There is always a significant minority of respondents who take shortcuts. And I think that could be the case here, because the respondents here are presented with a series of statements. Now, the first two items in this scale are, firstly, it is important to know about the Holocaust in today's world. And secondly, more needs to be done to educate people about what happened during the Holocaust. So at that point, you might be beginning to think, I can see a battery of statements about the Holocaust. Seems like I'm the kind of person who tends to agree with them. I'll just agree to the next few and assume that that represents my position. But the item we're talking about here, the third item, the Holocaust never really happened, is worded the other way round. It's what we call a reversed item, where if you believe that the Holocaust happened, you should now be disagreeing with the item. So you could easily fall into the trap of just assuming you agree with all these items and therefore not giving a response to this third item that actually represents your true view.
And ideally, you'd cross-check all the responses to make sure there was no inconsistency. Now, Opinion Matters says it has done that with the Holocaust deniers, but it wouldn't give us the full data on individual responses so that we could check ourselves. And from the data we do have, there are clues that there may be some inconsistency in people's responses.
One thing I actually noticed in the data, there is this question about how many Jewish people do you think were murdered during the Holocaust. Only 5 people in the entire survey gave an answer of 0. 5 people out of just over 2,000, so that's 0.25%. My guess is that that's probably something closer to the reality of what proportion of people genuinely don't think the Holocaust happened.
So what do the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust and Opinion Matters have to say about this?
Well, they stand by the results of the survey, and Opinion Matters says it's been carried out to the market research industry standards. And the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust admit to being surprised by the results. And they say, though, they've made it clear that they don't think 5% of people are actively and maliciously working to deny the Holocaust occurrence, and they do welcome further research.
It seems like there is a lot of ignorance out there, and clearly Holocaust denial is a real thing, and it'd be worth trying to measure how prevalent it is. So do we know of any other, perhaps more reliable research that can give us a better sense of the true numbers?
Well, there's an interesting story from the United States that tells us quite a lot. There was a study there in the early 1990s which put the number of Holocaust deniers at more than 20% of the US population. So you can imagine the horror and the headlines that caused. But survey experts didn't believe it and did further studies to test the finding. It turns out that the issue was with the wording of the question. So, listener, I'll give you the question now. See if you can answer it. Get ready.
Does it seem possible, or does it seem impossible to you that the Nazi extermination of the Jews never happened?
So the two choices for your answer are possible or impossible. Choose now. Okay, so I'll give you the answer. If you said possible, you are a Holocaust denier.
It's one of these confusing multiple negatives, like must not fail to miss.
I have to say, even though I knew the issue with the question, every time I read it, I got totally confused about which way I should answer. And I'm not a Holocaust denier.
And did the survey respondents also get confused?
They did. Many of them were. When studies were done with clearer questions and follow-up questions asking for detail of the respondents' beliefs about the Holocaust, it turned out that the correct number of Holocaust deniers in the US was more like 2% of the population. And experts have told me that studies in Europe have tended to give lower numbers still.
Well, thank you, Ruth. You're listening to More or Less. As Venezuela faces ongoing political turmoil, the country's economic situation is again in the news. Venezuela has been experiencing very high rates of inflation, often called hyperinflation, for more than 2 years. Some of our listeners were confused, however, when they heard that the inflation rate in Venezuela was forecast to be 10 million% in 2019. Celeste Smith was one of them.
I heard someone on Radio 4 saying that inflation was 10 million% in Venezuela. I then checked the price of a loaf of bread in Venezuela, and it was 70p. How does that add up? Was it infinitely cheap previously?
Good questions. The first thing to be clear about is that hyperinflation doesn't describe prices rising in terms of pounds or dollars. It describes prices rising in the local Venezuelan currency, the bolivar. If a loaf of bread costs 500 bolivars in November, 1,000 bolivars in December, and 2,000 bolivars in January, you've got hyperinflation. It might in each case be 70 pence, but what the bread actually costs if you convert the price to dollars or pounds isn't the point. So how fast are prices changing in Venezuela? Mariana Zuniga is a journalist in Caracas, and I asked her what's happening to the price tags on the goods she's buying at the shops.
Most of the time when I go to the supermarket, I don't find the tags of prices in products because it is impossible for the clerks or for supermarkets to change the prices all the time. It is also expensive for them, to buy the stickers and change it every week. Also, usually, like when you go to supermarkets, you see people grabbing products and then putting it back. You see this expression in their faces like, oof, it's more expensive than last week.
So how often are the prices changing?
Some people change prices 1 per week. Some others change prices 1 per day.
So let's take some basic food items. First, bread. Mariana said last month a loaf of bread cost 645 bolivars. This month it cost 1,600.
And for eggs it was last month 2,800 and now is eggs are so expensive, and now is 9,800.
To put this into context, the minimum wage is 34,000 bolivars a month. So to buy eggs, you'd have to work for more than a week on the minimum wage. So what are people doing to cope?
Well, it is for many people absolutely impossible to survive. And that's why we've seen so many Venezuelans leaving the country in recent years. There's also those who just starve, those who cut on meals, those who are going around trash trying to find something to eat.
There's no doubt that this is a crisis, causing real suffering to ordinary Venezuelans. But is it technically a hyperinflation? And how might it end? Steve Hanke is a professor of applied economics at Johns Hopkins University in the United States, and he's advised a number of governments on how to end their periods of hyperinflation. So first, when does inflation become hyperinflation?
Hyperinflation is defined as an inflation rate in which the monthly level of inflation exceeds 50% per month. We should be able to measure this for 30 consecutive days. If we hit that, we're in hyperinflation.
So what does he think about the forecast that by the end of 2019, inflation will be 10 million%? Some historical hyperinflation rates have been much higher, and that forecast comes from no less an authority than the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. But Steve Hanke isn't impressed.
I think it's really irresponsible because you can't forecast hyperinflations. No one has a model to do it. No one has ever done it. And it's just impossible.
That's because hyperinflation tends to be volatile, full of strange feedback loops and driven by political decisions in a time of crisis. Hyperinflation crises sometimes end very suddenly, and meanwhile there are often rapid changes in the inflation rate up and down. What we can do, though, is measure the current rate of inflation. And luckily for us, Professor Hanke is a world authority on the topic, having documented all 58 episodes of hyperinflation throughout history.
On the 30th of January, the annual inflation rate in Venezuela is 120,810%, and the monthly inflation rate is 263%.
That data roughly accords with Mariana's experience that in just 1 month, the bread price had almost tripled from 645 to 1,600 bolivars, and the price of eggs had more than tripled from 2,800 to 9,800 bolivars. So looking at his data for Venezuela, how does it compare to other periods of hyperinflation throughout history?
The big one, the number one, was Hungary, July 1946. Prices were doubling every 15 hours.
Which sounds bad, but you might not realise just how bad. That's the equivalent of an inflation rate of more than 40,000 trillion %. Not per year, but per month. Venezuela's hyperinflation is mid-table compared to that, the 23rd highest peak out of the 58 hyperinflations recorded. But in another way, it's worse than most.
The duration of the thing is getting up there now. There are only 4 hyperinflations that have lasted longer than Venezuela's. It's now lasted 27 months.
Thanks to Professor Steve Hanke and to Mariana Zuniga. You're listening to More or Less. Finding someone to love can be hard. You could try the traditional approach. Get a bit tipsy, meet someone's eyes across a crowded bar, stroll over with your best chat-up lines prepared, then realise they're staring straight past you and you have to keep on walking and pretending you were always headed to the loo instead. Or you could try dating websites and dating apps, offering to match you with people you could be sure were looking for love. Excellent. In fact, dating apps are so good that you can find thousands of people who like you. Or at least you can, if you're loyal listener, Helen.
Dear More or Less, I am a statistician who has a profile on the dating app Tinder. Today, I received the message, you've been liked by over 15,000 people since joining Tinder. I would like to know how this has been calculated, as I don't believe it is true. I'm no supermodel, and on a good day, describe myself as average looking.
Average looking, eh? Perhaps you should consider a career in radio, Helen. Anyway, to investigate, I asked our dating reporter, Phoebe Keane, to get on the case. Hello, Phoebe.
Hello. Well, I'm always willing to investigate such claims, so I went to visit Helen in Cambridge.
Hello.
Hi.
Come on in.
Thank you.
I wrote in because I'm a huge fan of the show. You get me through my ironing every Saturday.
Oh, is that what you're doing? Tim thinks you're listening intently to every word.
Fair enough. In our time gets me through my ironing.
So Helen is around 40 and is hoping to find someone who lives around Cambridge, where she's recently moved.
For the uninitiated, Tinder is an app that displays photos and information about people who are looking for a date. And if you like the look of them, you swipe their photo to the right. If they like you too, it's a match and you can send them a message. If you don't like the look of them, swipe left and you will never see them again.
Usually when you're looking at someone's profile, you can't tell if they've liked you or not. But Tinder have a paid-for version, Tinder Gold, in which you can see who likes you. And we just couldn't resist and asked Helen to upgrade so we could see who all these 15,000 men were. We were in for a surprise.
Okay, so Tinder Gold, that is 1,260 likes. That's not 15,000.
Oh! Instantly, yeah.
So instantly that's dropped.
I'm disappointed for you, I must admit.
I thought it'd be 1. So I'm not.
Well, so Tinder claims 15,000 likes, and then when Helen pays to see them, Tinder can only come up with 1,260 names. That is poor.
I know, I was disappointed for Helen, but there were still some hotties in there. What about Kevin? He looks like a right good type guy, doesn't he?
Is he skydiving? Bit of a flair there with his dancing, maybe, so we can like him.
Yeah, I think he's a like, because his first photo is him on the But then we began to notice another problem. Helen had set criteria for men she wants to be matched with. She told Tinder she only wants to be matched with men between the ages of 35 and 48, and who live within 48 kilometres of her home. But a number of men who'd liked her were way outside of that. Family Guy. Is that a good thing for you or not?
Yes, he had a dolphin. Well, he's in a pool somewhere with a dolphin and a huge smile on his face. but he's outside of the distance I have set.
63 kilometres is quite a way, isn't it, outside of your radius?
He might be worth it. So, let's like him.
Well, if he's going to take you swimming with dolphins.
Exactly. Now, you see, he's 893 kilometres away.
893 kilometres?
I think he might be a no.
So this is a guy who's got a really big beard, and it's almost down to his belly button.
I don't like beards.
Instant no.
Instant no.
This is classic
Well,
Tinder.
He's got a nice dog. I like his dog.
If you've had quite enough fun, Phoebe, it's a bit weird. I mean, I'm not going to blame Tinder for the beard. I mean, some people like to get tangled up in a good beard, but she said she wants to meet men who live within 48 kilometres, and Tinder's suggesting someone nearly 900 kilometres away. They do seem pretty comfortable just adding or removing zeros from the end of any numbers they like.
Yeah, although in fairness, they were at least within her age range, mostly. One was too old for her, although I thought he looked great for his age.
Well, that's nice to hear. Did you ask Tinder why it said 15,000 men liked Helen when really it was actually only 1,260?
Well, Tinder said it couldn't comment on individual cases.
Well, even though you told them Helen wanted them to comment on her individual case?
Indeed. It said the numbers are accurate and are not inflated. Apparently, if you've already swiped no to someone, they won't appear in the list of people who have liked you.
So I'm just trying to think this through. So Tinder have said 15,000 people have liked Helen, but she swiped no to, more than 90% of them, and they, the rejected lovers, have then disappeared from view.
Yeah. It implies that Helen would have had to have rejected at least 13,740 men in 18 months.
It's harsh.
I know, she really doesn't think she's done that. So I worked out that she'd have had to have swiped on around 25 people per day to have got through that many. She doesn't think that's what she was doing. But, Tim, time flies when you're having fun.
Time flies when you're breaking hearts, more like. But also, even the remaining 1,260 admirers often didn't fit her criteria.
Well, they could just be travelling, or they might have been within her radius when they liked her and have since moved on, or it could just be because the men had cast a wider net and had set a wider area within which to find matches. So Helen fits their criteria, even if they don't fit Helen's.
That's not how this works. Compatibility is supposed to be mutual, not one way. Anyway, we do know one thing, which is that there are differences in how men and women use dating apps. Although, to be honest, I only know that because I've been speaking to Marina Adshade, who's an economist at the University of British Columbia in Canada, and the author of Dirty Money, How Economics Influences Sex and Love. So when Marina's not busy lecturing, she is partial to a bit of swiping too.
I do have a Tinder profile, and like Helen, I've had mine for just about a year. And I also recently got a notification. I'm not as popular as Helen, but I've had 5,000 likes since I joined. And my daughter, she got a notification at exactly the same time as me, saying that she'd had 25,000 likes since she'd joined. Like Helen, she went, wow, that's mind-boggling that I've had so much interest.
So does she believe these numbers?
Yeah, so it's hard to imagine that you think that this is 5,000 people who really genuinely want to meet you and have a relationship with you. One thing that we know is that men swipe far more than women, just like sitting on their phones, swiping right. You know how when you go through and you get rid of all your old emails and you don't necessarily read them all? Mm-hmm. I think it could be a little bit like that.
There's research that suggests the same. In a study from Queen Mary University of London, they found that men swiped yes to the right much more than women. Because women were more selective, the men didn't get many matches, and as a result, the men became even less selective. That created a kind of feedback loop.
And then, as almost any person the woman swiped yes to liked them back, they were pushed to be even more selective, creating a starvation of matches for men. So that could explain women being surprised that so many people like them.
And Dr. Marina Adshade points to another factor.
There's far more men on these sites, all of these services. There's more men than women.
A lot more.
A marketing company called Oguri collects data from mobile app users. And recently it found that of roughly 750,000 Tinder users, 86% were men and just 14% women.
So if there are fewer women, the women are more in demand and they're more likely to get likes.
I can, in fact, verify from personal experience
Can you now? Can you?
that it feels like women are much more in demand and that men swipe yes to anyone and everyone. In the interest of research, I created a Tinder profile. I didn't write a bio, so the guys had no extra information about me. And I used just one photo of me looking, well, I'm going to say I'm not looking my best. Tim, do you want to have a look at the picture?
No, I don't want to have a look at the picture. I am saying nothing.
I've got a big pair of silly glasses on, so you can't really see my natural beauty.
Indeed not. So, OK, so you did not present yourself in the traditional fashion. Nevertheless, how was it received?
I swiped right, that's yes, to 100 men. Guess how many liked me?
I think any number I give is going to incriminate me. How many?
It was 40.
Oh, proving that 60 men have terrible judgment.
Oh, thanks, Tim. But I'm going to say it proves men really will swipe yes to anything, or that I didn't face much competition.
Well, very modest. So there are reasons to believe these numbers, but there are also some reasons why you might disbelieve them. And Marina Adshade can't shake the feeling that Tinder and other companies have a strong reason to make their numbers look as impressive as possible.
The thing is, these websites like Tinder, they have a huge incentive to give people the impression that there is an active market and that they're highly in demand on that market because they want people getting back on the app and using it because that's what generates their revenue. You know, they're just trying to say to us, wow, if you were on here, you would have so much attention and you should come back. And so it's a marketing strategy. And so that's what makes me skeptical. So I'm sorry to hear about Helen. I hope she wasn't too disappointed, but she was right.
Marina Adshade, economist and author of Dirty Money. And thank you, Phoebe. That is all we have time for, but please keep your questions, your comments and your swipe rights coming in. Our email is moreorless@bbc.co.uk. We're at BBC More or Less on Twitter, and I'm sure you can find Phoebe on Tinder if you try hard enough. We will be back next week. Until then, goodbye. More or Less was presented by me, Tim Harford, with Phoebe Keane and Lizzie McNeil. The producer was Ruth Alexander, the editor, Richard Varden, and our sound engineer, the pinball wizard of the studio, was Tom Brignall. The programme was made in association with the Open University.
It's 1994, and two pop stars are flying to a remote Scottish island.
Is your seatbelt on, Jimmy?
With two suitcases,
yes,
each containing £500,000.
Doing that thing where you pull it around yourself and it looks like it's fastened.
They're about to do something really stupid.
Shall I take your suitcases?
Or really clever.
No.
You decide. This is the story of two men who burned £1 million of their own money. Why? Why would you do that? How to Burn £1 Million by Sean Grundy and Cara Jennings. Download the free BBC Sounds app and subscribe or visit bbc.co.uk/sounds.
This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
Hello, welcome to the podcast of More or Less. I'm Ruth Alexander. This edition is something a little different. We've dusted off 3 items from our archives that you may or may not have heard before, but they're actually topics we've been contacted about a lot over the past few weeks, so we thought they're worth hearing again. One ties in with the UK Labour Party's recent claim that malnutrition in the UK has risen dramatically under the Conservative government, and another that's received a flurry of emails since a certain history programme was broadcast this year. Do our loyal listeners share blood with His Royal Highness King Danny Dyer? But first, you might be aware that a couple of weeks ago it was Groundhog Day. Again. Here's Tim Harford from 2012.
Now to the meteorological forecasting powers of a creature made famous in the Hollywood film Groundhog Day. On Groundhog Day, Punxsutawney Phil, a groundhog, comes out of hibernation to give his verdict on the weather for the next 6 weeks. If he sees his shadow, it's 6 more weeks of winter. If he doesn't, spring will come early. How anyone knows whether he's seen his shadow or not, I do not know.
Oh, I do. There are people who understand his snuffles.
Are there? Well, here's this year's prediction, as translated by, the people.
Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. On Gobbler's Knob, on this magnificent Groundhog Day, February 2nd, 2012, Phil proclaimed, "Many shadows do I see. 6 more weeks of winter it must be."
This is the one time when radio really fails to capture the true excitement of a large squirrel predicting the weather. But the more or less question surely is, given the difficulties humans have forecasting the weather, how accurate can a groundhog possibly be?
Well, Tim, you might be surprised. In the film Groundhog Day, weather presenter Phil Connors is sceptical like you, but in real life, a professor of economics has done some very interesting statistical analysis of Phil the Groundhog's meteorological assessments. Paul Summers of Middlebury College in the United States loves looking for patterns in data. He looked at the local weather records from 1950 to 1999.
I collected data, daily information on temperature 6 weeks before February 2nd, or Groundhog Day, and 6 weeks thereafter. So I had a total of 84 observations on minimum temperature, maximum temperature, and also snowfall. And what I was curious to do with my 3 student co-authors was to see whether or not there was a break in the trend line after February 2nd. For example, if the line suddenly shifts up, in other words, indicating that there's an increase in temperature on average, that would be an indication of an early spring.
The next step was to look back to see in which years Phil had seen his shadow and in which years he didn't.
Bottom line is Phil was correct more than 70% of the time. He was correct 87% of the time when he did see his shadow.
That's an impressive set of results.
We thought so because I think National Geographic, other detractors of Punxsutawney Phil, believe that he's no better than what you would get if you were flipping a coin. But indeed, he was significantly correct more than 50% of the time.
No sign of spring in Pennsylvania for some time then. Hats off to Phil and Paul, and thanks to the World Wide Web's ubiquitous Ruth Alexander.
That was Tim and me back in 2012. This year, Punxsutawney Phil saw his shadow and so predicts an early spring. However, forecasters are said to expect a long winter. But I ask you, who are you going to believe? Boffins or a woodchuck? We like to try to inject some fun into statistics, makes them more accessible, and frankly, is much more entertaining for us. Someone else who's trying to inject some fun into a topic that some people might find dull is the actor Danny Dyer, or should I say, His Royal Highness King Danny Dyer. Since his BBC television series aired at the beginning of this year, we've been inundated with requests to look into the probability of being related to kings and queens. Your wish is our command, so let's take you back to 2016.
It turns out that many More or Less listeners are also keen fans of Who Do You Think You Are? This BBC series traces the ancestors of famous people, and it's just returned, beginning with the film and TV actor Danny Dyer.
Danny Dyer!
Danny Dyer indeed, the man who plays the landlord of the Vic in EastEnders and who, against all expectations, has royal blood flowing through his veins.
If you follow the line back up to the top, you'll see where that name...
Edward III.
So, Edward III, yes, he's your 22 times great-grandfather.
Just have a moment.
Sure.
Just have a moment. Just have a moment to myself to just... A kid from Canning Town, Custom House. And this is my bloodline. This man's related to me.
The newspapers loved it. Splashes of Danny appeared next to his regal ancestors. but it also prompted a number of loyal listeners to get in touch and ask, is it really that special? If you go back far enough, are we all related to royalty? One academic has had a go at trying to work out, if you have English ancestry, what are the chances that you are related to King Edward III?
My name is Dr. Andrew Millard, Senior Lecturer in Archaeology at Durham University.
He says this isn't such a new idea.
The idea that lots of people are descended from Edward III seems to have been around for quite a while. It's a sort of story I heard as a child, and it appears in various things like biographies of Edward III.
We've consulted him for help on what is to follow. As you will all remember, King Edward III ruled England from 1327 to 1377. He reigned during the Black Death, and in an early foreshadowing of the Brexit vote, he began an extremely long war with France. He also, perhaps rather unusually for a king, seemed to get on rather well with his wife, and they had many children. And lots of those children reached adulthood, which was also rather unusual. Historians have tracked 245 great-great-grandchildren. Now we have to get a bit more speculative here, and our historian Andrew has been digging away at both ends of the demographic tunnel and hoping to make them meet in the middle.
I took a two-pronged approach. I looked backward into the past from somebody in the present day or recent past, and then also worked forward from Edward III to come to a sort of point of intersection.
So first, let's work forward from Edward's 245 great-great-grandchildren. By the late 1500s,
his family was increasing 3 times each generation, roughly.
Those 245 would have spawned about
20,000 descendants at that point.
And by that time, the late 1500s, we also have reasonably solid estimates of the population of England, 3.8 million. So we think that one English person in every 200 was descended from Edward III at that stage. Now, let's work backwards from 1977. Why 1977? Because it's a vintage year. It's the year that saw the birth of your friend and mine, East End boy, the very regal Danny Dyer. So remember, there's a 1 in 200 chance that any one of Danny Dyer's late 16th century ancestors was descended from Edward III. So how many late 16th century ancestors does Danny Dyer have? After all, Danny Dyer, like everyone else, has 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16, 32... Going back, say, 10 generations, you, me, and Danny Dyer would each have 2 to the power of 10 great-great-great etc. grandparents, or 1,024 of them. How many generations back from 1977 to the late 1500s? We reckon 14. Enough time to accumulate more than 16,000 great-great-great-great etc. grandparents. In fact, that suggests that Danny Dyer, or anyone of English heritage born in the 1970s, has 86 different late 16th century ancestors who were descended from Edward III. Now, there are a few questions about this calculation. One is international migration, people immigrate and emigrate. Another is a lack of social mixing. If rural labourers only marry rural labourers, or Londoners only marry Londoners, that changes our calculations. But we reckon that over several centuries, the social mixing is more than you might think. 6 centuries is plenty of time for rags to riches to rags again. But the most important question is about double counting. If 2 cousins marry and have a child, that child doesn't have 8 great-grandparents. She only has 6. Now, it turns out that this is pretty unusual. Marriages between first and even between second cousins are rare enough that they don't alter the calculations much, maybe 15,000 ancestors rather than 16,000. But of course, as your pool of ancestors spreads wider and wider, in the end, everyone is a distant cousin of everyone else. So this count of great-great-great-great-great etc. grandparents will include quite a lot of double counting. But remember, we reckon that in theory, Danny Dyer has 86 different royal ancestors in the 1580s. Maybe adjusting for double counting could reduce that to 46, or 26, or even just 6. But should we be surprised that Danny Dyer or anyone else with English heritage is related to Edward III?
Having shown that it's very likely for somebody to be descended from Edward III, the question is really whether you can actually demonstrate it. And people like Danny Dyer are actually very lucky in being able to demonstrate it and being able to find a continuous set of records all the way back through the past that have survived to the present day and record that lineage. Many people, they will reach a point in tracing their family tree where the records are simply missing and they can't go any further. And although we can talk about the probabilities, we can't actually prove it for the individual case.
Dr. Andrew Millard of Durham University.
Recently, the Labour Party released a video stating that malnutrition cases in the UK have risen by 54% since 2010. This is a topic that's been trending for the past few years, and in 2014 we looked into the figures behind the claims.
One of the stories that registered a giant blip on the more or less suspicious data radar came from the BBC's own website. An article with the headline,
"Food Poverty. Experts issue malnutrition health warning." More people are suffering from malnutrition as a result of worsening food poverty, experts have warned.
And went on to say that
conditions like rickets were becoming more apparent because people couldn't afford quality food in their diet.
So these are pretty serious claims, directly linking food poverty to specific diseases such as rickets. Ben Carter's here. You've been taking a look at this. What have you found, Ben?
Well, Tim, we can start by blowing up this claim that rickets is becoming more apparent. A study of Victorian diseases by the Health and Social Care Information Centre shows that the number of people being diagnosed in hospital with rickets has gone down by a third in the last couple of years.
So why was it reported as having gone up?
Well, John Middleton, Vice President of the Faculty of Public Health, was behind the rickets quote. He told me that he was talking anecdotally and conceded that the data painted a different picture.
Right. Well, the situation's different, though, when we count the number of people being admitted to hospital with malnutrition over the past year.
Yes, the number of recorded hospital admissions with malnutrition as a primary or secondary diagnosis has gone up from just under 4,000 in 2009-10 to nearly 7,000 in the year ending April this year.
Now, only a few hundred of these are primary diagnoses,
where someone is admitted to hospital and malnutrition is the main reason for that.
So most of them are secondary diagnoses, and that's when someone's admitted to hospital with, say, a broken leg, and whilst there, the doctor might make an assessment and say, you're also suffering from malnutrition.
Which means that a lot depends on how alert doctors are to the possibility of malnutrition.
I spoke to Professor Marinos Elia. He's chair of the Malnutrition Action Group of BAPEN, which is the British Association for Parenteral and Enteral Nutrition.
I have plotted those figures on an extended period ranging down from 2000, and there's been a 5-fold increase in the numbers of cases coded for malnutrition, and that clearly can't be due to a 5-fold increase in malnutrition in our society, although there may have been an increase in segments of society, such as the older people that are getting more prevalent in our community. There are one or two explanations. I think it does have to do with awareness. There's certainly been campaigns from governmental and non-governmental organisations to do with malnutrition and hydration. And there has been, over the years, a result of all these campaigns and initiatives, an increase in the proportion of screening that has been taking place in hospitals, and that will increase awareness.
So this increase may well be, at least in part, because doctors and health professionals are looking more closely. People who are diagnosed with a disease are coded by the hospital. It helps the hospital and the health service as a whole keep track of how many people are suffering with a particular illness.
But coding also serves another purpose. Hospitals work on payment by results, and if malnutrition was listed as a secondary diagnosis, then that could sometimes result in a hospital receiving more money.
OK. So we know that the number of recorded cases of malnutrition is on the rise, and we've heard some potential reasons for that. Is food poverty having an impact on the rising numbers?
Most people would assume that the more deprived you are, the more likely you are to suffer from malnutrition, and the data seem to back up that assumption. But while the most deprived people in society do suffer from malnutrition more than the least deprived, there isn't a great deal of difference. 40% of malnutrition cases occur in the 3 most deprived deciles, but 30% of cases occur in the 4 least deprived deciles.
But Ben, we need to be careful here because the deciles actually represent areas of the country rather than people. And so some of them might be poor people who are living in middle-income areas.
But when you look at other diseases in the study, things like TB and measles, there is a much more marked breakdown. Nearly 60% of cases in those diseases occur in the 3 most deprived deciles. Some poor people might live in more affluent areas, but the vast majority of inhabitants certainly aren't food poverty victims. So why are they suffering with malnutrition? Here's Professor Elia again.
One factor that needs to be considered is that malnutrition increases with age, progressively increases with age. And it's not clear if the least deprived, perhaps the more wealthy, upper socioeconomic classes that tend to live longer than the lower socioeconomic classes, develop malnutrition at a higher age. So if one was to adjust for age between the upper and the lower degrees of deprivation, perhaps a bigger gradient might become apparent.
As Professor Elia points out, malnutrition is much more common in the elderly. More than half of the 612 primary diagnoses recorded last year were in people over the age of 60. But in the past year, only 35 children or teenagers were given a primary diagnosis of malnutrition. This is predominantly an affliction of people who are already sick for other reasons, and particularly the elderly.
So returning to the article that prompted us to look at what was going on, we can say that hospital admission statistics on malnutrition don't really support the idea of families struggling to feed their children. In fact, they don't really throw much light on that possibility at all. They're designed for other purposes and strongly influenced by the training of doctors and the accounting systems of the NHS.
But we can also say that both Professor Elia and John Middleton think the number of official malnutrition diagnoses vastly understate the problem. Well, thank you very much, Ben.
Tim Harford and Ben Carter. And we hope to bring you a little more on that story soon. We do hope you enjoyed this special archive podcast. Do please keep your questions coming in to moreorless@bbc.co.uk. Or you can tweet us, we're at BBC More or Less.
This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
Hello and welcome to More or Less, the programme which brushes the teeth of statistics for the full 2 minutes. We floss too. This week, Victorian diseases are returning, but is austerity really to blame? Will moderate alcohol consumption really damage your mental health to the tune of £2,400 a year? And 8 years after his death, we thought Nigel Pargeter was a cold case, but a listener email has given us fresh interest into the goings-on at Ambridge. But first, on Tuesday, Today programme listeners woke up to the news that the left-leaning think tank, the Institute for Public Policy Research, had new statistics that showed the scale of the damage we humans are doing to the planet.
When you look at the scale of the problems outlined in the report, like the number of floods increasing by 15 times since 2005, extinction rates increasing by a huge rate, are these reversible?
The same numbers were reported in The Guardian and elsewhere, but they just didn't sound quite right to some people. For example, Mark Linus, author of 6 Degrees, a book about the effects of climate change.
So this jumped out at me because I was just in the middle of doing some research about the impacts of climate change for a book I'm updating, and it struck me that the claim that was being made about floods increasing by 15 times in the last few years since 2005, it just did not ring true with what I understood about the science so far.
So what happened next?
This is one of those rare instances where Twitter actually leads to a positive engagement and a friendly result on a debate about something. in that I tweeted that this didn't sound right to me, and one of the authors of the IPPR report responded and said that actually it was a typo, and where they'd put since 2005, that should have been since 1950 that these increases in climate damages had supposedly happened.
I'm not sure that's really how typos work. Maybe we should say that was a mistake rather than a typo, but anyway, fine.
Yes, and also I still wasn't quite satisfied with that either, because it still didn't sound right. Because if you look at the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where all of the scientific consensus material is written in these weighty reports every few years, they say they're not confident that there's been any increase in flooding around the world. So heavy rainfalls got worse. Yes, there's an increase in heat waves, but nothing like the magnitudes of what was being claimed in the IPPR report. And I wanted to know the source, and they said the research came from Jeremy Grantham, who's a rich person who writes reports on environmental things, and his source supposedly was a database of emergencies and disasters. And then Twitter, being amazing, the administrator of the database then got onto this and said that they didn't think it was correct for their database to be used to claim trends in numbers of floods.
Why not? I mean, it sounds like a reasonable source.
It does, but the thing is, there's lots of other things that affect flood impacts other than just climate change. For example, what's happening in the built environment, more structures there which are likely to get flooded. So economic growth and population changes do have a much, much bigger impact on recorded damages than just climate trends.
Okay, so the source of the claim was a database, and the administrator of the database says you shouldn't use our database to draw conclusions about the impact of climate change. So what do we know? I mean, you've written about this. What do we know about the impact of climate change on extreme weather, flooding, and so on?
We actually know quite a lot. The IPPR had said that floods have increased 15 times since 2005, or corrected to 1950. But if you do look at what the scientists are saying, so look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and if I quote you from their latest report, which was issued only a few months ago, they say, in summary, stream flow trends since 1950 are not statistically significant in most of the world's largest rivers, while flood frequency and extreme stream flow have increased in some regions. So it's very different from what the IPPR were claiming. And, I'm not a climate skeptic. I'm not somebody who goes out there trying to debunk what's being said about the urgency of climate change. But if you overstate the case and you use erroneous facts and figures, then I think you undermine a lot of what was in the report, which I thought was actually very valuable.
Mark Linus. Half the More or Less team have been struck down with ferocious colds. My own regimen of religiously scrubbing my hands and avoiding all physical contact with other humans has so far protected me. But the Labour Party has more on its mind than the common cold. It's been complaining of some strange afflictions on Twitter.
Thanks to austerity, these Victorian diseases are back. Figure 1, scarlet fever, 208% increase in cases. Figure 2, whooping cough, 59% increase in cases. Figure 3, malnutrition, 54% increase in cases. Figure 4, gout, 38% increase in cases. The poorest in society are suffering the most, and this inequality is costing the NHS an extra £4 billion a year.
Sobering statistics, but are they right? And what's the link between them and austerity? We asked the Labour Party to explain.
The reason for increases in hospital admissions for these diseases is complex, but hindered by the backdrop of austerity, which has meant rising child poverty and an NHS with 100,000 staff shortages, including health visitors falling by a fifth since 2015, school nurses falling by a quarter since May 2010, district nurses by 43% since May 2010, and GP numbers falling by 1,794 since 2015.
Well, against the background of austerity is a bit vague, and the fact that their baseline jumps backwards and forwards from 2010 to 2015 and back again, that's the kind of thing that always makes me twitchy. So we went looking for the connection ourselves between tight or falling government spending and the rise of old-school afflictions such as gout. I'm joined now by our Victorian disease correspondent, Typhoid Mary McNeil.
My name's Lizzie, Tim.
Whatever. Tell us about scarlet fever. What is it? Is it going up?
Well, it's a bacterial infection which used to kill a lot of children, but is now easily treated with antibiotics. Labour is quite correct to say that since 2010 there's been a dramatic resurgence in the number of cases in the UK. However, no one really knows why. It has gone up in Asia too, although there's no obvious connection between the rise here and the rise there. Public Health England has told us that it is common to see peaks in the number of scarlet fever cases approximately every 4 years. However, the increases seen recently are much greater than the usual historical peaks.
So could it be, as the Labour Party claims, because of austerity measures?
It could be, but there's no particular evidence that it is. I looked at the rate of scarlet fever across the income distribution, and you might expect it to be a disease of the poor. But the poorest 10% had the lowest rate of scarlet fever. The richest 10% had the second lowest rate. Go figure. Maybe socioeconomic status is not the key factor.
What about whooping cough?
Whooping cough is another bacterial infection, and the Victorians were no stranger to it.
When the disease proves violent and the patient is in danger of being suffocated by the cough, he ought to be bled, especially if there be a fever with a hard, full pulse. But as the chief intention of bleeding is to prevent a rupture of the blood vessels of the lungs and to render it more safe to give vomits, it will seldom be necessary to repeat the operation. Yet, if there be symptoms of an inflammation of the lungs, a second or even a third bleeding may be required.
Oh, yikes. Thankfully, modern medicine's improved, cutbacks or not, so has whooping cough been staging a comeback?
Yes. Again, the Labour Party is correct to point to a rise in numbers over recent years. In 2012, there was a huge spike in the incidence of whooping cough to over 9,000 cases. This has since fallen to just over 4,000 cases in 2017. Much lower, but not at the levels seen in the noughties, which were recorded well below 1,000 cases.
So the timing sounds right. Recession in 2009, coalition government announces tax rises and spending cuts in 2010, spike in cases in 2012.
Yes, but the rise in whooping cough has been global, and particularly pronounced in the United States. It seems more likely that the increase in cases is because of what's been going on with the vaccine. There's a whooping cough vaccine which only works if you get at least 2 doses. Children in the UK are vaccinated at the ages of 2, 3 and 4 months old.
So is the problem here because of the anti-vaccine movement?
No, the whooping cough vaccination rate in the UK has stayed fairly stable at 94% for the last 25 years. But there was a change in the vaccine in 2004, and the new vaccine seems to be either less effective or to wear off after around 6 years. Researchers reckon that the resurgence in cases might be because of that.
So that's whooping cough and scarlet fever. Now, the Labour Party also mentioned gout, which Wikipedia tells me is a form of arthritis caused by an excess of uric acid.
Yes, and Henry VIII is probably the most famous sufferer.
It is seen as an affliction of the rich, corpulent and male. I do like a glass of port with my Stilton, I must admit. Maybe I need to be careful. But isn't this a disease of excess, not a disease of austerity?
That's actually a bit of a myth. Researchers haven't found any link between gout and social class. Perhaps Tudor binge eating did contribute to gout, but these days it's more likely to be due to hereditary factors, kidney dysfunction, or an excess of uric acid found in red meat, offal and seafood.
Well, offal maybe, but red meat and seafood, hardly the food of austerity.
No. Now, the Labour Party research pins the rise of gout cases on an increase in obesity, smoking and alcohol consumption. However, the data we have for smoking and alcohol consumption suggests they're going down. An estimated 8.1% of adults over the age of 65 smoke, and obesity levels are flat since 2010.
Well, thank you, Lizzie. Now, the final point, malnutrition, that's also something that's on the rise, and something it seems most obvious must have something to do with either austerity or poverty. Now, we actually looked at malnutrition figures in a past episode, and we're re-podcasting that this week. If you've got time, have a listen. But in summary, what we found is that malnutrition is mainly a disease of old age. It has gone up, but part of that is because there's been a push for better reporting. Elderly people from less advantaged backgrounds are indeed more likely to be affected, but it also affects the elderly from the most advantaged backgrounds too. So, to sum up, the Labour Party is correct to point out that these diseases are on the increase. The link with austerity, however, is a stretch. It's not impossible, but it's by no means proven. And fortunately, both scarlet fever and whooping cough are much easier to treat than they were in Victorian times. I'm still a bit worried about the gout, though. You are listening to More or Less. In case you were thinking of laughing off the report about gout and pouring yourself a generous glass of something or other, the Sunday Times has bad news for you.
Downing a bottle of wine a week costs, gulp, £2,400 a year in lost quality of life.
That claim, made a couple of weeks ago, had our loyal listeners spluttering into their Pinot Noir.
I could believe that downing 20 bottles of wine a week could lead to a loss of £48,000 a year, but surely one bottle of wine doesn't lead to £2,400.
As the drinker of probably a couple of pints a week, I find it difficult to accept that it causes any loss in my quality of life.
How come I'm still alive and solvent when for 30 years I drank 2 pints a night, which amounts to £13 million?
The newspaper was reporting on a study funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, the Medical Research Council, and Alcohol Change UK. So what did it really say, and should we believe it? People who drink more are also more likely to suffer from depression and neuroticism. And people who earn more are less likely to suffer from depression and neuroticism. What causes what, of course, is open to question. Maybe depression limits your ability to earn, rather than money being a cure for depression. Now, the basic idea behind the report is to compare the trade-offs between income and alcohol in terms of these mental health problems. But I was confused, and so I spoke to Professor Sir David Spiegelhalter, medical statistician at Cambridge University and chair of the Winton Centre for Risk and Evidence Communication, to talk me through it.
Well, it's known that depression and neuroticism are higher in heavy drinkers and are lower in richer people. So what this group did is use a very respectable biobank database for 130,000 people and estimate how much extra you'd have to earn on average to balance the increased depression and neuroticism associated if you drank more. So the final claim is an extra glass of wine a day, so a bottle of wine a week, is associated with some additional depression and neuroticism. And on average, people would have to earn 8% more income in order to offset that additional depression and neuroticism from drinking that bottle of wine a week. And they use an average income of 30,000 quid. 8% is £2,400, which is £48 a bottle.
So, I mean, loosely speaking, they're saying that if you earned £32,400 a year, you would be about as depressed and neurotic as someone who earned £30,000 a year but didn't drink the bottle of wine that you drank.
Yes, you can counter that extra depression and neuroticism from the bottle of wine by earning a bit more.
Which is different from saying that the psychic cost or the health cost or whatever is $2,400, I think.
Yeah, there are a number of problems with this. I'd say the first one is this crucial assumption that there's a linear relationship between well-being and alcohol or income. In other words, however much you're earning or drinking, the effect of drinking a little bit more is always the same.
So as one listener, I think, put it, I can believe that drinking 20 bottles of wine a week might cost you $48,000. I can't believe that drinking one bottle of wine a week will cost you $2,400. You can see what they're getting at.
This linear assumption, of course, actually, it doesn't seem particularly plausible. I mean, even the authors state that the models suggest a J-shaped association curve between consumption and various measures of personal utility. What that means is, for example, depression is lowest and happiness in greatest in light drinkers, not non-drinkers or very light drinkers.
Hang on, and a bottle of wine a week, that's pretty much the definition of light drinking, isn't it?
Yes. So those are the people that currently seem to be happiness and least depressed. And also we know the relationship between income and well-being is not linear. Once you get sufficient wealth, no matter, you don't benefit from becoming wealthier. So I think there's a problem with this sort of linear assumptions. And the other thing is that this is only an association. There's no evidence that any relationship corresponds to the effect of changing behaviour. In fact, they did have a group of 11,000 people they followed up over time, and they found that a change in alcohol consumption had no effect on depression, and increasing income even made the depression worse.
Just to push on that point a little bit, so it might be, for example, that people who are depressed or neurotic might be inclined to try to self-medicate with some alcohol. It might not help them, But it's not clear that the alcohol is causing the depression might be causing the consumption of alcohol.
Yeah, there's all sorts of reasons why things might change anyway.
So anything else that should worry us about this study?
I had a real problem with the coverage that this story got, with the headline, "Each weekly bottle of wine is equivalent to $2,400 a year in damage to health and quality of life." Well, the study makes no claim that that's the case. That's not what the study shows. The Sunday Times says the aim was to compare alcohol's benefits, such as making people feel happy or sociable, with a higher risk of depression, insomnia and cognitive decline. Well, it didn't do that either. And they've even got a quote from one of the researchers saying that alcohol damages your brain, body and relationships, whatever drink it comes from. Our research estimates the actual value of that damage. And I feel that really overstates what this study does.
Although if the Sunday Times has quoted the author, we should partly attribute blame to the author as well as to the Sunday Times then.
This was a direct quote from the author, yeah.
So how would you summarise what the study did find then?
The study did find that people who drank more, were slightly more depressed and neurotic, and the people who earned more were slightly less depressed and neurotic. And I would say that's just about it. I feel the claims made by the study are very exaggerated.
Professor Sir David Spiegelhalter. We put Sir David's points to Professor Simon Moore of Cardiff University, one of the authors of the report. He replied that they were quite circumspect in what they claim, and that they were testing whether an econometric technique was able to capture the intangible costs of alcohol, and that they were careful in the paper to avoid stating a causal relationship. You're listening to More or Less, and if you have any questions or comments, why not drop us an email? We're at moreorless@bbc.co.uk. That is exactly what Martin Jameson has done.
Dear More or Less, I write to you concerning a most serious matter. I have been listening to The Archers for 52 years. On the Sunday 10th of February episode, Jill Archer's new squeeze, Leonard, was expounding in a complimentary manner as to the architecture of Lower Loxley. As a chartered surveyor, he continued at some length as to the origins of the building and, significantly, referred to the decorative parapet running around the roof of the building.
Interesting. Take the stone parapet, for instance. That would have been added to give the building extra grandeur.
Oh, right. I see.
Before then, I imagine it had an overhanging, hipped roof.
Fascinating.
Am I right about the roof?
Now, hang on a minute. You don't have to be as dedicated a listener as me to remember that in January 2011, much-loved Archer's character Nigel Pargeter met his death falling from the roof of the same building. There was significant debate at the time as to the height of Lower Loxley due to the length of Nigel's scream. Even on More or Less.
Your high school physics, you'll know that Nigel's flailing form would have accelerated at almost 10 metres per second. He'd have started at a speed of 0 and finished the first second at a speed of 10.
Which posited quite correctly that a vertical drop sustaining that length of scream would have to be at least 60 metres, just under 200 feet. Equivalent to 20 stories and not consistent with a building of that period. The most plausible explanation offered by Tim Harford was that Nigel must have slid down the diagonal pitch of the roof before falling off the edge and onto the ground no more than 15 metres below. So you see the problem. If Nigel slid down the roof, his fall would have been broken by the stone parapet. So which is it, Archers? Sincerely, Martin Jameson.
A puzzle indeed. Now, our Archers correspondent, Ruth Alexander's here. Hello, Ruth.
Hi, Tim.
Any ideas?
Well, I'm just not sure how much light I can shed at this stage. I've been asking some questions, and this is what a BBC spokesperson said.
Thank you to our eagle-eared listeners for their tireless investigation into Nigel's death. Lower Loxley is a very large house that was originally Jacobean but also has later additions. We cannot be sure of Leonard's exact location in Lower Loxley when he noticed the parapet, but we can conclude, thanks to Martin's analysis, that he can't have been in the same location as where poor Nigel fell to his death.
So, that clears it up.
You don't believe that, do you?
Yes, I think it makes sense.
You don't know, then, about what's been going on?
About what? Something's been going on?
Look, I've heard some rumours, but I can't say any more until the current controller of Radio 4 leaves the BBC.
What? Gwyneth Williams? Are you saying you think the controller of Radio 4 is somehow involved in Nigel Pargeter's death?
Yes, there's a cover-up.
Are you feeling okay, Ruth?
Nigel is buried under Gwyneth's office.
Ruth, I've been to her office. It's on the 4th floor.
Exactly. She's a monster.
Right. Shh. Thank you, Ruth. That's it for the current series of More or Less. Ruth's been working very hard on this series, and it might be best for her to have a lie down. Fortunately, we have another team working on our podcast, which is available every week from BBC Sounds or wherever else you get your podcasts, and you can keep your questions coming in to moreorless@bbc.co.uk. We'll be checking our inbox for your emails and your conspiracy theories, and we'll be back in April. Until then, goodbye. More or Less was presented by me, Tim Harford, with assistance from Lizzie McNeil. Our producer was Ruth Alexander, our editor, Richard Varden, and our studio sorcerers were Rod Farker and Graham Puddifoot. It's produced in association with the Open University.
Hi there, I'm sort of sorry to interrupt, but not that sorry. It's Jane Garvey here, and I just wanted to make absolutely certain that you'd heard about Woman's Hour. It's a programme about women, but it's for everyone. We've got loads of fantastic guests like Malala.
My university friends would not call me a role model.
Oh, wouldn't they? Okay, well, I'm actually rather encouraged to hear that. Thought-provoking conversations.
The term clean eating gives off the narrative that if you don't eat that way, then you're dirty and you're eating dirty food.
And we mark big moments for women around the world. 100 years to the very day, women in this country could vote for the very first time. A round of applause from all of you, please. A ripple of excitement. Please, join in. Subscribe to Woman's Hour on BBC Sounds.
This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
Hello and welcome to More or Less on the BBC World Service. We're your guide to the numbers in the news and in life, and I'm Tim Harford. Comedy mathematician Matt Parker has a new book out, Humble Pi. That's pi without an E. As you might guess, it's a celebration of the causes and consequences of mathematical, engineering and programming errors. You might think of a mathematical error as taking place in the realm of abstract thought, but an engineering error can be painfully visceral. Consider the following maintenance issue from a BA or British Airways flight in the happy, heady days of 1990.
This was someone working on a BA aircraft, and they were replacing a windscreen, and they had took the bolts out and they had to put new bolts in, and they got the wrong bolts when they put them back in again. I bought some of these bolts. So I bought A211 7D bolts and A211 8C bolts.
7D and the 8C, they're
dangerously close. The 7C, according to the specifications, is 0.026 inches wider, about 0.66 millimeters, whereas the 8C technically 0.1 inches longer. So that's about 2.5.
So one's slightly longer.
One's slightly longer.
Slightly thinner.
The 8C is slightly longer. The 7D is slightly wider. But if you hold them, very hard to tell the difference. And so this guy took the bolts out of the aircraft. To be fair, he correctly identified what they were, but they didn't have enough. And so we had to drive to a different storeroom, and all these incredible series of things went wrong, like him forgetting his glasses that day. And later on they checked, and like over half of the compartments in the store had the wrong parts in them.
And there was a particular kind of wrench that he could have used.
Exactly.
That would have helped him see that there was a problem, but that was missing, so he had to
he used a different one, and that meant that his hand was covering it, so he didn't see they didn't fit properly.
One tiny mistake after another tiny mistake.
After another. And then the window blew out of the aircraft as it hit cruising height, and the pilot was sucked out of the window. The steward was coming back in at the time, saw this, grabbed their legs, and then they took turns holding the pilot's legs while they then flew and landed, and the pilot survived, recovered, and went back to flying.
Brave pilot.
Incredible.
We should talk about rounding errors. In the More or Less offices, I am the rounding guy. I'm
Excellent.
always saying, look, we should round off. It's ridiculous to give this long number to this excessive degree of precision. We should just say about
number.
Blah.
Yeah.
But that's not always the right strategy.
But the fact that we like to round numbers gives you a little bit of wriggle room that you can get away with. And
if you're the kind of person who likes to get away with things.
If you're the kind of person who likes to get away with things, and that happens a lot in politics. When the Trump administration first came to power, they were trying to appeal the Affordable Health Care Act, Obamacare, and Congress weren't having it. So they thought, instead of doing it through legislation, we can do it through rounding. So the Affordable Health Care Act stipulates various things, including that insurance companies can't charge their most expensive customers more than 3 times what they charge their cheapest customers. Because the whole point is you want to distribute the load. You don't want to pile all the cost onto a few people. And so while they couldn't change that ruling, they could change how the Department of Health and Human Services interpreted the act into the actual regulations that insurance companies had to follow. And so they suggested that insurance companies could charge their customers 3.49 times as much as their cheapest customers because, and I quote, 3.49 rounds down to 3. I mean, if the act had said rounded to the nearest whole number, they could have got away with it. But you can't just say because under a certain type of rounding, this number's the same as this number. It doesn't make the numbers identical.
Yeah. I just bought something at Co-op that they advertised as £1. They charged me £1.49, which I had assumed was just the system hadn't been updated with the new price. But now I realise £1.49 is £1.
It is £1. It's like, say, borrow £149, pay back 100. We call that doing a Donald in the biz. Anyway.
We discover from your book that if you type something into Microsoft Excel will not necessarily give you the correct answer as an output.
No, it's so good.
This just blew my mind.
So it's like if I ask you, like, 5 subtract 4 subtract 1, that's 0, right?
Yeah.
And if you put that into Excel, to be fair, it'll get the correct answer. But if you put in 0.5 subtract 0.4 subtract 0.1...
Also 0.
Also 0, until you put it all in brackets and then multiply it by 1, and you no longer get 0 as the correct answer. Because Excel is obviously doing this in binary, and it's only got so many digits it can store each number in, and binary is not good. Just like base 10 is not good for a third. We can never write down a third, because we keep writing down 0.33333, and eventually we run out of space. So we have to round it at that point. And Excel, in binary, it's not easy to write a half or 0.4. And when it rounds it, and it does, to be fair, it does check and try and stop this from sneaking out. If you put it all in brackets and multiply it by 1, it doesn't do the check at the right time, and you get an answer which is close to 0, but not 0.
So if people wish to try this at home with Microsoft Excel, they should do the sum 0.5 minus 0.4 minus 0.1, put the whole thing in brackets, and multiply by 1, and they will get 0.0000000,
Yep.
but not 0.
Yeah, they see something like e to the negative 27, so it's implying there are all these zeros. At least it's in scientific notation, but yeah.
Tell us about how time is going to stand still.
In the 1970s, when computers were starting to talk to each other, they had to come up with an agreed way that every computer could tell the time and it would be consistent. And so the suggestion they came up with was that computers should just count the number of seconds since the beginning of 1970. Very straightforward. And this is stored as a 32-digit binary number. And they were like, well, hang on, when's that going to run out of space? And they went, it's not going to run out for another 68 years. And you think of people in the 70s, like in the last 68 years before them, humankind had gone from the Wright brothers to being on the moon. And they're like, well, 68 years from now, they'll have a new system, right? That's the future's problem. We'll do it now, and later on someone can clean up the mess. It was a very baby boomer solution, I guess, to the problem.
Well, not completely ridiculous, because memory was very expensive in 1970, and so you're going to give extra memory over purely to the challenge of counting more seconds.
Exactly, and they figure we'll have a new system by the late 21st century. We're over halfway there now, and we haven't got a new system. And so the number of seconds you can store as a 32-bit binary number is 2,147,483,647. And so when we hit that many seconds, which will happen at 3:14 a.m. in the UK on Tuesday, the 19th of January, 2038, any system which is still using a 32-bit method for keeping track of time, which is still a lot of systems, not all now, we're starting to update them, but some I think will still be running that, they're going to suddenly grind to a halt. And a lot of microprocessors and a lot of computer systems are going to abruptly stop, unless we can fix everything between now and then.
Sounds a bit like Project Fear to me. If I had a Mac and I wanted to ask my Mac what time it was in seconds. How do I do this?
Right, so there is an app on every Mac called Terminal, which is how you kind of bypass the operating system to interact directly with your computer. And don't be afraid if you open it up. It looks a bit scary, but it's fine. If I type date, but then space, I'm going to put a plus sign, a percent sign, and the letter S for seconds.
Date, space, plus, percent S.
Yes, right? That's telling the computer to just give me the number of seconds. And so if I hit that, immediately I've got the number 1,548,862,762.
Matt Parker. His book, Humble Pie, is out in March. And if any loyal listeners want to email and tell us exactly when we recorded the interview with Matt, our address is moreorless@bbc.co.uk. That is all for this week's edition of More or Less, but do please keep your statistical questions and your comments coming in. Until next time, goodbye. More or Less was presented by me, Tim Harford, and produced by Lizzie McNeil. Our editor was Richard Varden, and our studio engineers, Rod Farker and Graham Pudderfoot.
This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
In this edition of More or Less, David Edmonds asks, how do you make your artwork more valuable?
Hello and welcome to More or Less on the BBC World Service. We're your weekly guide to the numbers all around us. I'm David Edmonds. My wife says I'm no oil painting, but this week I'm taking the big picture of the art market. If you want to die in poverty, take a lead from the 19th century Dutchman Vincent van Gogh and become an artist. Notoriously, Van Gogh remained poor throughout his life, and most artists struggle to make a living. On the other hand, the global art market is now huge, worth a staggering $63.7 billion in 2017. And some artists do very well.
So, thank you, Charlie.
But what drives the price of art in auction? Well, principally, of course, it's quality. But beyond that, are there tips for auctioneers, or artists, or buyers of art, on how to maximise their sale price or their return on investment? Rachel Pownall is Professor of Finance at Maastricht University in the Netherlands and specialises in the art market. Here is a countdown of 6 tips and suggestions.
Tip 6. Sell on a sunny day.
OK, so it's easier to depict a sunny day on canvas than to control the actual weather. But Rachel Pownall says there appears to be a sunshine premium.
In the art market, you would think that people aren't necessarily prone to changes in the weather, but they are, of course, very emotionally driven. So one study that we did a few years ago was looking at the prices in London when there was exceptionally good weather. So what we found is that paintings that sold in the winter period on a particularly sunny day were 3 to 4% higher. This wasn't the case at the top end of the distribution, where again, perhaps buyers have a lot more self-control. They've set themselves a limit potentially, but was driven at the bottom end of the market.
Tip 5. Buy contemporary artists.
It's riskier, but for a chance to make a big return on your art investment, acquire the work of a modern artist. Compare, for example, the huge sums now commanded for the works of Scottish-born figurative artist Peter Doig or the American artist Jean-Michel Basquiat, who died in 1988, aged 27.
If we consider living artists, contemporary artists, what we find with their price points is there's a discount for them. They sell for a slightly lower price than different genres such as the old master paintings, impressionists and postmodern and so forth. What we also see with contemporary artists is their prices are much more volatile. Their potential to make gains is much greater. The chances of an old master doubling is really quite small. Yet if you consider the contemporary artists, it's not surprising at all to see prices having doubled, tripled. If you look at an artist like Peter Doig or Basquiat, the return on those particular artists over the last few years has been extremely high. We're talking about 100% or even more in that respect.
65 million, that's $71 million. 72 million, all done, that's 77,500,000. Bread Spitter at 77 million.
Tip 4. Buy a work from the beginning or the end of an artist's career.
It's tricky to generalise about the art market because each artwork is unique. But Rachel Pownall has identified a trend. An artist's early works and their later works tend to be more valuable than those from their middle period.
Indeed, we find this plateauing out of prices for a lot of artists around their 40s, 50s. People talk about a middle-age crisis. It's not surprising that perhaps artists also have the same. But yet we see a lot of artists who then do particularly well later on in their careers again.
This U-shaped price is true, for example, of the French artists Edouard Manet and Claude Monet. Many artists seem to emerge from a still midlife and get a second wind. Artists who constantly experiment in particular, such as Lucien Freud, can produce valuable works well into their sunset years.
Tip 3. Don't sell a work of art last in an auction.
Auctioneers care most about their so-called star lots, the items that promise to sell for the highest price and earn them